Galactic Empire panics. Not in our records. Moments later, their fleet was destroyed. Part 1. The Galactic Senate of the Velarath Empire had never heard of Earth. That was the first problem. Senator Draken Voss stood at the center of the great circular chamber, his gray-blue skin catching the soft light of the floating orbs above. He held a data slate in his four-fingered hand and stared at it with all three of his eyes. Around him, dozens of other senators from dozens of species waited for him to speak. He finally looked up. "There is no record of this world," he said. "I have searched our Imperial Registry. I have checked the Stellar Cartography Bureau. I have even looked in the old pre-Imperial maps from 4,000 years ago. The planet does not exist." A low murmur swept through the chamber. "And yet," said Admiral Vorath, a tall creature with silver scales and a voice like gravel, "our long-range scanner buoys have detected a Class M world at coordinates 221 Gamma 7, a world with a population, a world with technology, a world sending out electromagnetic signals in all directions." "Signals?" said Senator Voss. "Thousands of them. Radio waves, microwaves, digital pulses. They have been broadcasting into the void for over 100 of their planet's years. And no one answered them." The Admiral paused. "Until we did." The chamber went quiet. Senator Voss set down the data slate. This was either very simple or very dangerous. In his experience, things that could not be explained were always the second one. "What is the world called?" he asked. "According to their own transmissions, they call it Earth." Admiral Vorath tilted his head. "The dominant species calls itself humans." More murmuring, longer this time. Voss cleared his throat. "Send a standard first contact probe, tag the system, get me a full survey within 30 cycles, and in the meantime, say nothing to the outer colonies. If this world somehow slipped through our records, it may be a clerical error." "And if it is not a clerical error?" asked one of the younger senators from the back. Voss looked at her with his three eyes. "Then we handle it the way we always handle things that are not in our records." He did not explain what that meant. He did not need to. Everyone in the chamber already knew. Earth had no idea any of this was happening. On the surface of the planet it was a Tuesday. In the city of Geneva, a woman named Dr. Priya Chandrasekhar was finishing her third cup of coffee and staring at a screen full of data that made no sense. She worked for a small, underfunded division of the United Nations called SETI Global, which was a polite way of saying she spent her days listening for alien signals and usually hearing nothing. Until 3 days ago. The signal had come in from roughly 14 light-years away. It was structured, clean, mathematical. It repeated in a pattern that no natural source could explain. Her team had verified it 6 times. Then they had called their supervisors. Then those supervisors had called their supervisors. And now Priya was sitting in a glass conference room with people from 3 different governments, 2 space agencies, and 1 very confused general. "We should respond," said Priya. "We should not respond," said the general. "They already know we're here," said Priya. "We've been broadcasting for 100 years. Whatever sent that signal already knows exactly where we are." The general had no answer for that. The signal was decoded over the next 48 hours. It was not a greeting exactly. It was more like a form, a standard bureaucratic intake form, as far as they could tell. Name of world, name of dominant species, level of technological development on a scale the translation did not fully explain, current government structures, population count, resources. "It reads like a tax form," said one of the linguists. "Or a census," said another. Priya stared at it. She had spent her whole career dreaming of this moment. First contact. The discovery that humanity was not alone. She had imagined it 1,000 ways. A great beam of light, a hovering ship, a godlike voice from the sky. She had not imagined a form that asked for population count and resource inventory. "So what do we do?" the general asked. Priya picked up her pen. "We fill it out." The Velarath probe arrived at the edge of the Sol system 7 cycles later. It began scanning immediately. The star, the gas giants, the asteroid belt, the rocky inner worlds. When it reached the 3rd planet from the star, it recorded everything. The readings were strange. The planet had a single moon, which was unusually large for a world its size. The atmosphere was thick with nitrogen and oxygen. The surface was mostly water, and the technological signals coming from it were inconsistent. There were traces of nuclear fission, primitive ion drives, a handful of small craft in low orbit around the planet, several old satellites, but also something else. The probe's sensors picked up a second set of signals, different from the first. These were coming from the direction of the planet and aimed outward, aimed at the probe itself. The humans had detected the probe. They were scanning it back. The probe transmitted its data to the nearest Velarath relay station. The relay station sent it to the Central Registry. The Central Registry forwarded it to the Imperial Scientific Bureau. The Imperial Scientific Bureau sent back a report 6 days later. It said, "Primitive pre-FTL civilization. Estimated technology level, Class 3. Standard first contact protocol applies. Non-threatening. Recommend standard absorption process." Admiral Vorath read the report. He nodded. Class 3 was not a concern. He had absorbed dozens of Class 3 civilizations in his career. They were always the same. Surprised, a little frightened, eventually grateful. He sent a message back to the Senate. Pre-FTL, primitive world, likely no record, because they were too minor to flag. Standard absorption recommended. 1 diplomatic vessel plus standard escort should be more than sufficient. Senator Voss approved it. The fleet was prepared. Priya had not slept in 2 days when the response to humanity's transmitted form came back. It was short. It said, "Your registration has been received and processed. A representative vessel will arrive at your system within 40 of your planetary rotations for the purpose of formal integration discussions. Please do not be alarmed. This is standard procedure." She read it 3 times. Then she read the last 2 words again. Standard procedure. She turned to the room full of officials and generals and diplomats. They were all staring at the screen. Nobody spoke for a long moment. "Integration," the general finally said, his voice flat. "That's what it says," said Priya. "What does that mean for us?" Priya set down her coffee cup. She looked at the screen. Outside the window, the city of Geneva was still moving. People going about their days, buying food, arguing with each other, watching television, completely unaware. "It means someone is coming," she said, "and they expect us to just go along with whatever they have planned." She was quiet for a moment. "We should probably tell them a few things about us first," she said. The general raised an eyebrow. Priya almost smiled. "We're going to need to make a file. A proper one. Everything. History, wars, biology, psychology, technology. Everything we've ever done. Let them read it before they get here." "Why?" "Because whatever they're expecting," she said, looking back at the message on the screen, "it's not us." The Velarath diplomatic vessel was called the Sovereign Reach. It was 300 meters long, painted in the deep violet and gold of the Imperial fleet. It carried 40 crew members, 12 diplomatic staff, and a standard escort of 6 fighter craft. It also carried a device called a compliance array, a powerful signal emitter that could broadcast a message directly into the neural communication bands of most known species. The compliance array was rarely used. Most civilizations, when they saw the Sovereign Reach and its escort, understood immediately what was expected of them. Admiral Vorath was not aboard the Sovereign Reach. This mission was beneath his rank. He sent a junior diplomat named Sarath Khan instead. Sarath was efficient, well-trained, and had completed 14 standard absorptions in the past 3 years without incident. As the Sovereign Reach entered the outer edge of the Sol system, Sarath stood at the observation window and looked at the distant yellow star. He pulled up the file on the human world. Population, approximately 9 billion. Technology, Class 3. No known FTL capability. No known energy shielding. No known warships. He closed the file. This would be quick. He turned to his communications officer. "Broadcast the standard arrival greeting on all frequencies. Let them know we are here." The communications officer nodded and sent the signal. For 3 minutes, there was no response. Then a signal came back. Audio only. A human voice. Calm, female, speaking in a language the translator rendered smoothly into Velarath standard. "Sovereign Reach. This is Dr. Priya Chandrasekhar, of SETI Global, speaking on behalf of the planet Earth and its unified governments. We received your arrival notice. We'd like to talk before you come any closer. We've prepared some materials we think you should review first. Sarath blinked all four of his eyes. No Class 3 civilization had ever asked for a delay before. They usually just panicked. He composed himself. He told his officer to tell them they would review their materials and to ask them to transmit. The transmission came through 30 seconds later. It was enormous. Thousands of files, images, documents, video recordings, historical archives, scientific papers. Sarath looked at the volume of the data and felt something strange, something he could not quite name. He sat down in his chair and began to read. An hour later, he was still reading. 2 hours later, his aide came to check on him. Sarath waved the aide away without looking up. 3 hours later, Sarath set down the data reader. He sat very still for a long moment. Then he opened a channel to the nearest relay station. "I need to speak with Admiral Vorath," he said. "Right now. It is important." There was a pause. "The Admiral is in a Senate session, Ambassador. Can it wait?" Sarath looked out the window at the small yellow star in the distance. He thought about what he had just read, about the wars, about the weapons, about the species that had nearly destroyed itself 11 times over and kept coming back, about the creatures that had learned to split the atom within the same century they first learned to fly, about the ones that had reached orbit in less than 70 years from inventing powered flight, about the species that responded to extinction-level threats not with despair but with engineering. He thought about all of it. "No," he said, "it cannot wait. Galactic Empire panics. Not in our records." Moments later, their fleet was destroyed. Part 2. Admiral Vorath did not leave his session easily. It took 3 urgent messages from Sarath Khan before the Admiral finally excused himself from the Senate chamber and walked into the private communications room. He was irritated. He had been in the middle of a vote on tariff rates for the outer colonies, which was dull work but important work, and he did not appreciate being pulled away by a junior diplomat over a Class 3 absorption. "This had better be serious," he said. Sarath's face appeared on the screen. The diplomat looked pale, even by Velarath standards. His eyes were wide. "Sir," said Sarath, "I need you to read the file I am sending you. All of it, please. I will have my staff summarize." "No, sir." Sarath cut him off, which was almost unheard of. "You need to read it yourself. I am not sure how to summarize it." Vorath stared at him for a moment. Then he sat down. "Send it." It took Vorath 4 hours. He was a fast reader. He had been reading military reports and strategic assessments for 50 years. He had seen the histories of 100 absorbed worlds. He had read about wars, revolutions, famines, and collapses. He thought he understood what civilizations looked like. By the end of the first hour, he had set down his drink. By the end of the second, he had called in his senior tactical officer to sit with him. By the end of the third, the tactical officer was also very quiet. By the end of the fourth, Vorath closed the file and sat in silence for a full minute. Then he said, very carefully, "How many ships did we send with the Sovereign Reach?" 6 escort fighters and the diplomatic vessel, sir. Standard protocol for a Class 3 world. Vorath nodded slowly. "And what," he said, "is the current status of our nearest military fleet?" "The 7th Expansion Fleet is at Toreth Station, sir. 42 ships, 24 hours from the human system at standard jump." Vorath said nothing. He looked out the window at the slow drift of stars outside the station. "Sir," said the tactical officer. "Get me Sarath back on the line," said Vorath, "and do not move the 7th Fleet, not yet." He paused. "Not until I understand what we are dealing with." What Admiral Vorath had read, and what had disturbed him so deeply, was not any single piece of information. It was the pattern. The humans had fought wars. Every species fought wars, but humans fought them constantly. Across their entire recorded history, there were only a handful of decades when no conflict of any kind was occurring somewhere on their planet. They had developed weapons of staggering destruction and then continued building bigger ones. They had invented chemical weapons, biological weapons, explosive devices capable of leveling entire cities, and then, This was the part that truly unsettled the Admiral. They had signed agreements not to use those weapons, and mostly kept those agreements. Mostly. They had survived 2 world-level conflicts within the same century. The second one ended with the use of nuclear weapons, a class of weapon the Velarath had banned in their own early history, after discovering what it did to a planetary surface. The humans had used it, twice, and then they had stopped using it, and then they had built 10,000 more of them and pointed them at each other for 50 years without firing. That was what broke Voreth's tactical mind, not the weapons, the restraint. They had built enough nuclear warheads to kill every living thing on their planet several times over, and somehow, through sheer stubbornness and mutual terror, and something the file called diplomacy, they had not done it. He did not know whether to be impressed or terrified. He realized, both. The biological section was almost worse. Humans were, by any standard measure, absurdly fragile. No natural armor, no venom, average strength below most predator-class species. They required sleep for a third of every rotation cycle. They bled easily. They broke easily. And yet, their evolutionary history was a horror show. The planet they had evolved on was, by the classification standards of the Imperial Scientific Bureau, a Class 6 biohazard world. Roughly 60% of the native fauna was capable of killing a Velarath adult. The oceans were full of apex predators the size of small ships. The insects alone had driven more than a dozen xenobiologists to quietly request desk assignments. The humans had not just survived this planet. They had named everything on it, categorized it, built cities on every landmass, and were currently debating how to protect the most dangerous animals from going extinct because they found them fascinating. They kept some of the predators as pets. Voreth read that 3 times to make sure he understood it correctly. Humans kept carnivorous pack hunters in their homes, fed them, groomed them, and called them friends. He closed his eyes. Priya was getting very little sleep. The transmission logs were updating every few hours. The alien vessel had received their data packet. It had not moved. It had not responded. It had just sat there, on the edge of the solar system, very quiet. They stopped moving, said her colleague Marcus, pointing at the tracking display. He was a thin man who had once worked for a radio telescope array in Chile and now seemed to be aging rapidly in real time. Is that good or bad? I think it means they're reading, said Priya. Reading what? Everything we sent. Marcus stared at the display. The alien ship was a small dot, barely distinguishable from background noise at this distance. What exactly did we send them? He asked slowly. Everything, said Priya. I told you, all of human history, as honestly as we could put it together in 48 hours. She paused. Wikipedia. Translated. Most of it. Marcus put his face in his hands. You sent them Wikipedia, and the UN archives, and selected military history documents, and a general overview of our biology and medicine, and a sample of literature and art. She shrugged. They said they wanted to know about us. I thought it was better to be honest. Some of that is, Priya, some of our history is not exactly flattering. I know. The wars, the weapons, I know, she said again. That's the point. Marcus looked at her. If they think we're weak, she said, very calmly, they'll try to absorb us like a colony. If they know what we actually are, what we're actually capable of, then the conversation starts differently. She looked at the dot on the screen. They stopped moving. They're thinking. That's what I want. I want them thinking. Marcus was quiet for a long time. That's either very smart or very dangerous, he finally said. Priya nodded. Yes. Sarath Khan had a headache. He was sitting in the Sovereign Reach's private dining room with a cup of warm gel broth going cold on the table in front of him and a data reader in his hands that he had not put down in 6 hours. One of his staff members had come in twice to check on him, and both times he had waved them away without looking up. He had reached the section on human psychology. It was, he thought, the most confusing thing he had ever read. Humans were simultaneously individualistic and tribal. They formed groups and then argued violently within those groups. They competed with each other in almost every domain of activity, and also built hospitals to care for strangers they would never meet. They developed philosophies of peace, and then went to war over how to implement those philosophies. They were capable of tremendous cruelty and also extraordinary kindness, sometimes in the same individual, sometimes in the same day. They got bored easily. That part actually frightened him more than the weapons. Species that got bored looked for stimulation. Stimulation often meant exploration. Exploration meant expansion. The humans had not yet left their own solar system. By their own accounts, they had barely reached their moon, but the rate at which they developed technology suggested that this was a temporary state of affairs. He did some math. At their current rate of technological advancement, which had been roughly exponential for the past 2 centuries, the humans would likely achieve faster than light travel within, he recalculated twice because the first answer seemed wrong, within 200 to 300 years. He set down the reader. 200 to 300 years. In galactic terms, that was not long. That was barely a blink. The Velarath Empire was 4,000 years old. Most of the species they had absorbed had taken 1,000 years to develop FTL after achieving nuclear capability. The humans had achieved nuclear capability and were on track to achieve FTL in under 4 centuries. He picked up the reader again. He went back to the section on human history and looked more carefully at the timeline, at the progression of inventions, at the way each breakthrough seemed to lead immediately to 3 more. The pattern was not the pattern of a species that was finding its way slowly and carefully through the universe. It was the pattern of a species that was running. Sarath put the reader face down on the table. He opened his communication channel to Admiral Vorath. "Sir," he said, "I think I need to change my recommendation." Vorath, who had clearly not slept, looked at him from the screen. "Change it to what?" the Admiral asked. "I don't think standard absorption is appropriate here, sir." Sarath chose his next words very carefully. "I think we should ask them what they want." A very long silence. "That is not standard protocol, Ambassador." "No, sir, it is not." Sarath paused. "But I have a feeling that if we try to tell these people what is happening instead of discussing it with them, we will regret it very quickly. They have been alone for their entire history. They have survived everything their planet threw at them. They have survived everything they have thrown at each other." He picked up the reader and held it up toward the screen, though Vorath could not see the content from there. "Sir, this species did not get to 9 billion people by giving up when something larger than them showed up." The Admiral said nothing. Sarath lowered the reader. "I would like to request permission to begin genuine diplomatic dialogue," he said. "Not the standard intake process, real dialogue." Vorath rubbed the bridge of his face with 2 of his fingers. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "Approved," he said at last. "But Sarath, do not make any promises. Not yet." "Understood, sir." The channel closed. Sarath sat back and looked at the ceiling of the dining room. After a moment he opened a new channel, not to the Admiral, not to the Senate, but outward, toward the blue and white planet hanging in space 14 million kilometers away. "Dr. Chandrasekhar," he said, in carefully translated English, "I have finished reading. I would like to talk." Galactic Empire panics, not in our records. Moments later, their fleet was destroyed. Part 3. Priya had been awake for 37 hours when the alien called her by name. She was sitting at her workstation in the makeshift command center that had been set up in the UN building in Geneva. Around her, 40 other people were doing various things, monitoring signals, translating data, arguing quietly about protocol, and in the case of 2 political science professors, having what appeared to be a minor breakdown. Priya was drinking her 8th coffee of the day and reading a report on the linguistic structure of the alien transmission when the new message came in. The voice was clear. The translation was smooth. They had installed a real-time translation program 3 hours ago, keyed to the alien language patterns they had been studying. The alien had said, "I have finished reading. I would like to talk." Priya set down her coffee very carefully. She looked at Marcus, who was sitting 2 seats away. He had also gone very still. She leaned toward the microphone. "Hello," she said. "Thank you for reaching out. I am ready to talk." There was a 3-second delay, light-speed lag. Then the voice came back. "My name is Sarath Khan. I am the diplomatic representative of the Velarath Empire. I want to tell you something before we begin, because I think it is important." All right, said Priya. We did not know your world existed before 3 weeks ago. That is not an excuse. It is simply true. You were not in our records. A pause. That was our mistake. I am sorry for it. Priya blinked. She had not expected an apology. Around her, the room had gone completely silent, 40 people holding their breath. I appreciate that, she said. I have read everything you sent us, Sarath continued. All of it, your history, your biology, your wars, your art, your science. Another pause. You have had a very difficult time of it, as a species. Priya almost laughed. You could say that, she said. You have also been remarkably resilient. We try, said Priya. A slightly longer pause this time. I want to be direct with you, said Sarath. The reason we are here, the reason we sent that initial message, is because our empire has a standard process for dealing with new worlds. In most cases, the world is brought into our empire as a member world, a colony, initially. Given representation over time, benefits of the empire, including protection, trade, infrastructure, it is, in most cases, considered beneficial. Priya kept her voice very even. And what would you call our case? A pause. Unusual, said Sarath. The conversation lasted 11 hours. Priya's throat was raw by the end. She had taken 2 breaks, eaten a sandwich she barely tasted, and changed the coffee order from regular to double. Sarath, on the other end of the signal, seemed to have similar endurance. He asked careful questions and listened to her full answers before responding. He did not interrupt. He did not talk down to her. He was, she thought, a genuinely good diplomat. The outline of the situation became clear over those 11 hours. The Velarath Empire was vast, spanning over 300 star systems, with 114 member species. It had existed for 4,000 years. It was not, by any measure Priya could imagine, a hostile entity. It had expanded through negotiation more than warfare, though warfare was not something it avoided when necessary. Standard protocol for a new world was what Sarath had described, an integration process that began with assessment, moved to negotiation, and ended with the world becoming a formal member of the empire. Member worlds kept their governments. They contributed resources and personnel to the empire in exchange for access to empire-wide technology, trade routes, and military protection. It sounded, Priya thought, something like the European Union, but stretched across 300 solar systems. The part that concerned her was the word assessment. What does assessment mean specifically? She asked. It means, said Sarath carefully, that we evaluate the world's technology level, population stability, political structure, and, in a diplomatic sense, its likely trajectory, whether it is likely to be a contributing member or a destabilizing one. Priya kept her eyes level. And what does the assessment say about us? The pause that followed was one of the longest of the conversation. The initial assessment, said Sarath, classified you as a Class 3 civilization, pre-FTL, non-threatening, standard absorption candidate. Another pause. Having read your materials, I believe that assessment is incorrect. How incorrect? The correct classification may be somewhat higher, said Sarath. Priya leaned forward slightly. How much higher? We do not have a standard classification for what you appear to be, said Sarath. That is also somewhat unusual. At the same time, 37 light-years away, the Imperial Scientific Bureau was doing its own reassessment. 3 analysts had been assigned to the human file. Their names were Vorin, Chell, and a young newly graduated analyst named Pak, who had never worked on a first contact case before. Pak had been given the assignment because she was the lowest-ranking member of the team, and therefore expected to do the most tedious work. The tedious work turned out to be the most alarming. She had been tasked with reviewing the technological development timeline, which inventions appeared when, what the rate of progress looked like across different domains of science. It was supposed to take her half a day. It took her 2 hours before she stopped and went to get her supervisor. Look at this, she said, showing Chell the chart she had built. Chell looked at it. He had been working in the Bureau for 30 years. He had classified civilizations ranging from primitive agricultural to near FTL. He knew what normal looked like. That is not normal, he said. The chart showed the humans' technological development over roughly 3,000 years. For most of that time, the agricultural era, the early mechanical era, progress had been slow. The curve was flat, almost no slope at all. Then, starting roughly 250 years ago by the human's own calendar, the curve went vertical. Not steep, vertical. Steam power, then internal combustion, then electricity, then radio, then nuclear energy, then computing, then digital networks, then genetic engineering, then early space travel, all in the span of time that most civilizations spent developing their first writing systems. This is, Chell trailed off. Unprecedented? Said Pak. I was going to say concerning. He looked at the chart again. Their current computing technology. What does the analysis say about it? Pak pointed to a subsection. Chell read it. His color changed slightly. The humans had recently begun developing artificial intelligence, not simple decision systems, genuine generative intelligence, capable of processing information at speeds that rivaled organic minds. They were using it for everything: medical research, scientific modeling, language translation, entertainment. They were also, some of their own scientists and political figures argued in publicly available documents, extremely worried about what happened if the AI became smarter than them. They are aware of the risk, said Pak. They argue about it constantly. Some of them want to slow it down. Some want to accelerate it. Most of them are just trying to use it before the argument is settled. Chell set down the report. Get me Vorin, he said. And then get me a direct line to Admiral Vorath. The diplomatic conversation between Priya and Sarath had reached a delicate point. What do you want? Sarath asked. It was a simple question, but the way he asked it was careful, thoughtful. Priya considered it for a long moment. We want to remain ourselves, she said. We don't want to be absorbed. We don't want to be told what to do or how to organize our societies. We've been doing that ourselves for thousands of years, and we're still working on it. That is understandable. But we also know that we can't just say no to an empire that spans 300 systems. That would be unwise. Also understandable. So what I want, said Priya, is a conversation. A real one. Not an intake form and not a standard absorption process. I want to talk as equals about what comes next. Sarath was quiet for a moment. You are aware, he said carefully, that we are not, in any technical sense, equals. Your world has not left your solar system. Our empire spans 300 systems. I am aware, said Priya. And you are still asking to be treated as equals. Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. Why? Asked Sarath. Priya was quiet for a moment. She thought about how to say it. Because every civilization in your empire started somewhere, she said. And I don't think any of them started like us. She paused. I think you know that. I think that's why you're still sitting at the edge of our solar system talking to me, instead of flying in and handing us a membership form. The light-speed delay stretched between them. Then Sarath said, You are correct. And then he said something that Priya did not expect. I would like to request permission to visit your world. The room went so quiet that Priya could hear the ventilation system. In person, she said. Yes, I think this conversation is better had face-to-face, or whatever the equivalent is for our species. Priya looked around at the room full of people, at Marcus, who was staring at her with enormous eyes, at the generals and diplomats and scientists who had all gone completely still. She looked back at the microphone. Give us 24 hours to prepare, she said. Of course, said Sarath. The channel clicked to standby. Priya sat back in her chair. Marcus leaned over. Did you just invite an alien to Earth? He whispered. Yes, said Priya. Should we have voted on that? Priya thought about it. Probably, she said. But I don't think we had time. She stood up and stretched, and looked at the room full of people who were all waiting for her to say something. All right, she said, we have 24 hours. Someone get the Secretary General on the phone. Someone else start figuring out where we are going to land their ship. And someone, please, get me more coffee. Galactic Empire panics. Not in our records. Moments later, their fleet was destroyed. Part 4. The landing site they chose was a dry lake bed in Nevada. It was large, flat, and far enough from major cities that a panicking crowd would not be an immediate problem. The military had been involved in the choice, naturally, and they had also positioned 3 battalions of soldiers around the perimeter, along with 12 fighter jets on standby at a nearby base. The generals had wanted more. Priya had talked them down. She had pointed out, gently but firmly, that if the alien ship wanted to do something hostile, no number of fighter jets would be sufficient, and if it didn't want to do something hostile, the fighter jets were an embarrassing overreaction. The generals had not liked this reasoning, but the Secretary General had backed Priya up, and so the fighter jets stayed on the ground. The alien shuttle descended at mid-morning on a clear blue day. It was smaller than Priya expected, roughly the size of a large military transport helicopter, shaped like a smooth, dark oval with no visible seams or engines. It made almost no sound. It came down slowly, cautiously, and landed without disturbing a grain of dust, which seemed physically impossible, but was nevertheless what happened. A panel in its side dissolved open. Sarath Khan stepped out. He was taller than a human, about 2.5 meters, and built on a slimmer frame, with 4 arms held close to his body, in what Priya would later learn was a gesture of non-aggression. His skin was a deep silver green, slightly iridescent in the Nevada sunlight. He had 4 eyes, arranged in a slightly different configuration than human eyes, and a wide, flat nose, and a mouth that was thinner than a human mouth, but capable of a wider range of movement. He was wearing a dark uniform, with no visible insignia, which she had specifically requested. She had not wanted this to look military. He stepped onto the dry lake bed and looked around. His 4 eyes moved slowly across the horizon, taking in the sky, the dry mountains in the distance, the small group of humans waiting 50 meters away. Then he walked toward them. Priya walked forward too. They met in the middle. Up close, he was even stranger. The slight iridescence of his skin caught light in ways human skin did not. His eyes moved independently, and she had the unnerving sensation that he was looking at her, and the sky, and the ground, and the military perimeter, all at the same time. He stopped 2 meters in front of her. She had prepared a speech, a proper one. 3 paragraphs about the hope of peaceful relations between worlds, about the extraordinary moment in both their civilizations' histories, about the future they might build together. She looked at him. He looked at her. She forgot the speech entirely. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said. His translator rendered his voice in smooth, slightly accented English. "It is good to meet you." "You too," she said. And then, because she was Priya Chandrasekhar, and she had been awake for 48 hours, and had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 2 weeks. "Are you hungry? We can offer food, though we are not sure what you can eat safely." Sarath blinked all 4 eyes at once. Then he made a sound that the translator did not render, but that sounded very much like a surprised, quiet laugh. "You are asking if I want food," he said. "You've traveled a long way," said Priya. He made the sound again. "Yes," he said. "I suppose I have." The talks lasted 3 days. They were held in a small conference facility that had been hastily assembled near the landing site. Clean, neutral, uncomfortable in the way all temporary facilities are uncomfortable. Priya led the human delegation. Sarath led a small team of 4 Velarath staff who had come down from the ship. The humans had brought their own delegation, 2 linguists, 1 biologist, 3 diplomats, 1 general who insisted on being present and spent the entire time looking deeply unhappy, and Marcus, who was there because Priya refused to do it without him. On the first day, they talked about basics, what the Velarath Empire was, how it worked, what member status actually meant in practice, what the humans' current political structure was, and how it related to the concept of a unified representative voice for the whole planet, a concept the Velarath found confusing, because most member worlds had a single government. The idea of a species with nearly 200 sovereign nations, all technically independent, was something Sarath had to have explained to him 3 times before he stopped looking baffled. "So you have multiple governments," he said slowly, "which sometimes are at war with each other." "Sometimes yes," said Priya. "But you are also negotiating with us as a unified entity." "We formed a committee," said Priya. Sarath's 4 eyes all moved to look at her at the same time. "In 3 days," he said. "We can be efficient when we need to be." He looked at her for a long moment. "Evidently," he said. On the second day, they got to the harder questions. Sarath raised the issue of the nuclear arsenal first. Directly, without apology, which Priya appreciated. "You have weapons capable of destroying your planet multiple times over," he said. "What do you intend to do with them?" "Nothing," said Priya. "Nothing?" "We've had them for 80 years. We haven't used them in conflict since the very beginning. We keep them as a deterrent. It's not ideal," she admitted, "but it works. You are preventing war through the threat of mutual destruction." "Mutually assured destruction, yes, we call it MAD." She paused. The acronym is intentional. Sarath was quiet for a moment. "And this system," he said, "has held for 80 years. More or less. There have been close calls, but yes. Most species," said Sarath, "when they develop nuclear capability, either use the weapons within the first generation or destroy them and move on. We did neither," said Priya. "No," said Sarath. "You built 10,000 of them, pointed them at each other, and then all agreed very loudly not to fire them." He paused. "That is an unusual solution. We are an unusual species. I am beginning to understand that." On the third day, Sarath asked his most important question. They were sitting alone in the conference room. The rest of both delegations had stepped out for a midday break. It was the first time they had been without attendance, and it felt different somehow, quieter. "Can I ask you something personal?" said Sarath. "Of course," said Priya. "Are you afraid?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I think most humans are afraid right now. Some people think this is the end of everything we know. Some think we're about to be enslaved. Some are excited, most are just trying not to panic and not quite managing it. And you?" She looked at her hands on the table. "I'm afraid too," she said, "but I'm also curious. And when I'm curious, I can manage the fear." She looked up. "Is that strange?" Sarath considered it. "For you," he said slowly, "I think it may be the most human thing you have said to me. Back in the Velarath Senate, things were not going smoothly." Senator Voss had received Admiral Voreth's updated report. He had also received the Scientific Bureau's revised assessment of the human world, and he had received, to his considerable irritation, a copy of the transcript of the ongoing diplomatic discussions. He read all 3 documents in succession. Then he called an emergency session. The chamber was full when he stood to speak. "The Earth situation," he said, "is no longer a simple matter of absorption." He laid out the facts calmly. The revised technological assessment, the exponential development curve, the nuclear deterrence structure, the AI development, the species' psychological profile, particularly the sections on adaptability, stubbornness, and what one analyst had called pathological persistence under stress. The chamber listened. When he finished, one of the older senators, a gray-scaled veteran from the Torith system, raised a hand. "What is the recommended course of action?" Voss looked at the data slate in his hand. "Sarath Khan has recommended that we reclassify Earth as a first-tier contact and open formal alliance negotiations rather than standard absorption. Admiral Voreth has cautiously supported this." He paused. "The Scientific Bureau has added a notation that I will read directly." He looked down at the slate. The notation says, quote, "This civilization, if left to develop independently, will achieve FTL capability within an estimated 200 to 300 years, and at current trajectory, will at that point represent one of the most formidable expansion forces in this sector. Early positive engagement is strongly recommended." End quote. The chamber was very quiet. 2 to 300 years, said the veteran senator. "Yes. That is," the senator trailed off. "Fast," said Voss. "Yes." He looked around at the chamber. "I will be putting forward a motion," he said, "that we treat Earth not as a world to be absorbed, but as a world to be engaged. That we offer them something we have not offered to any civilization in 2,000 years. He let that sit for a moment. A partnership, an equal one. The muttering in the chamber was louder this time. But it was not, Voss noticed, entirely hostile. He waited for it to settle. The alternative, he said, is to attempt standard absorption against a species that has spent its entire history refusing to accept terms it did not agree to. He set down the slate. I have read their history. I do not think that will go the way our standard protocols expect. The veteran senator cleared his throat. You think they would resist? Voss looked at him steadily. I think, he said, that every civilization that has ever tried to tell these people what to do has eventually had a very bad day. He glanced at the data slate, and I would rather not be next. Galactic Empire panics. Not in our records. Moments later, their fleet was destroyed. Part 5. The fleet appeared without warning. It came out of FTL jump at the edge of the Sol system at 0400 hours, Earth Standard Time. 8 ships in tight formation, bearing the colors of the Velarath Expansion Corps. Not the Diplomatic Corps, not the Survey Division. The Expansion Corps. The signal from these ships reached Earth 17 minutes later, because that is how long light takes to cross that distance. By that time, Priya and Sareth were both awake, standing in the command center at the temporary facility near the Nevada landing site, staring at the same data feed. The fleet's commander had transmitted a single message on all Velarath standard frequencies. It said, by order of a minority faction within the Velarath Senate, this world is hereby designated for immediate military absorption under emergency protocol. The diplomatic process is suspended. Resistance is not recommended. Sareth read it twice. His silver-green skin went a shade paler. I did not authorize this, he said. The Senate did not authorize this. There is a faction. Senator Draken Voss has political opponents who have been pushing for a harder line since the discussions began. He turned to Priya. I am sorry. I did not think they would move this fast. Priya was already on the phone. Pilovo. The next 6 hours were the most chaotic in human history. Every government on the planet was informed simultaneously. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session within the hour. Priya was patched into it by video link from Nevada, still standing in the command center, still not having slept. The generals were, predictably, calling for a response. The question was, what kind? The fleet was 8 ships. They were large, each one roughly the size of an aircraft carrier, from what the human tracking systems could tell. They were sitting at the outer edge of the solar system, which suggested they had not yet decided to move inward. The message had been a declaration, not yet an action. Priya knew that gap, between declaration and action, was the only thing she had to work with. She also had Sareth. He was already on his own communication channel, broadcasting back to the Velarath fleet. His voice was very controlled, very precise. This action has no authorization from the Senate or the Diplomatic Corps. The commander of this fleet is acting outside their mandate. I am ordering an immediate halt and withdrawal pending Senate review. The response came back after a light-speed delay. The fleet commander, a Velarath named Kesov, was not interested in Sareth's orders. Ambassador Khan, said Kesov, the Senate is divided. A vote was called and the result was contested. In the absence of clear direction, Expansion Corps protocol gives me authority to proceed. I am proceeding. Sareth closed his eyes briefly. Then he opened them and looked at Priya. He is going to move the fleet inward, said Sareth. We have perhaps 4 hours before they reach a position from which they could threaten your orbital infrastructure or your surface. Priya looked at him steadily. 4 hours, she said. Yes. She turned back to the room and started giving orders. What happened over the next 4 hours was something that the Velarath, in all their 4,000 years of history, had never seen. The fleet moved inward, slowly, confidently. Kesov had done this before. 14 absorptions in his career, all clean. He expected exactly what he always got. A frightened world, some scrambling around on the surface, a few primitive military transmissions, perhaps an attempt to communicate that would end with submission. Class 3 worlds always submitted. They always had to. He was watching his long-range scanners when the first thing happened. The Earth's orbital satellites, all of them, the communications ones, the weather ones, the old navigation ones, began repositioning. It was subtle at first, small adjustments, then less subtle. The network was reorganizing itself. His sensor officer frowned. "Commander, the Earth satellite network appears to be clustering." "Clustering into what?" said Kesov. There was a pause. "I am not sure yet, sir." Kesov watched the display. The satellites, there were hundreds of them, old ones and new ones, all sizes, all designs, clearly built across different decades by different organizations, were arranging themselves into a loose formation. It looked almost like they were being herded into position. He had an odd feeling, which he pushed aside. The second thing happened 20 minutes later. Human military transmissions began broadcasting on a frequency his translator picked up and processed. They were not directed at him, they were directed at each other. He listened. The humans were coordinating, all of them, not just one nation, dozens, working together in real time. He heard references to coordinates and timing, and what sounded like targeting solutions. He heard them sharing resources without being asked. He heard nations that his briefing notes indicated had been in active political conflict 10 years ago now, exchanging technical data without hesitation. The third thing was what finally made him stop the fleet. A new transmission came in, audio only, directed at him specifically, on the diplomatic frequency. The voice was calm, female. "Commander Kesov," said Priya Chandrasekhar. "My name is Dr. Priya Chandrasekhar. I am speaking on behalf of the people of Earth. We have been informed of your intent. I would like to explain your situation to you." Kesov leaned back. "Go ahead," he said, mostly because he was curious what a Class 3 primitive would say. "You have 8 ships," said Priya. "We have counted them. They are large ships. We do not have ships to match them." A pause. "What we have is roughly 400 active satellites now in positions that create overlapping coverage of your fleet's projected approach path. Several of them are old communications satellites, but some of them are not. Some of them are the ones we stopped reporting publicly some years ago, because certain governments decided they preferred that nobody else knew about them." Kesov sat forward. "In addition," she continued, "we have redirected 7 ground-based radar arrays to tracking your vessels. We have 19 ballistic missile systems that have been reconfigured, imperfectly, I'll grant you, but configured, for orbital trajectories. We have 11 nuclear-armed missiles that we have always maintained in launch-ready status for deterrence purposes. We know these are unlikely to destroy your ships. We know that you have shielding we don't understand, but they will damage them, Commander. They will make them hurt." Silence on the channel. "We are also broadcasting this conversation," Priya said, "on every frequency we can reach, to every receiver within range, including the ones your Empire uses. We want the rest of your Senate to know what your fleet commander chose to do when asked to stand down." A very long pause. "Is that all?" said Kesov. His voice was flatter now, less amused. "One more thing," said Priya. "Ambassador Sarath Khan is still aboard his shuttle on the surface of our planet. He has told us, voluntarily, that his safety is not a factor in your calculations, and that we should not use him as leverage. We are not going to. That is not who we are." Another pause. "But we are telling you that he is here, and that he has been treated with complete respect during his visit, and that we would like to keep talking to him, and through him to your Senate, rather than doing something that can't be undone." The voice was quiet for a moment. "We don't want to fight you, Commander, but we will not simply accept this, not without a fight. That is not who we are either." Kesov stared at the speaker for a long moment. Then he turned to his second-in-command. "Hold position," he said. The Senate vote, when it was finally called cleanly and counted properly, went against Kesov's faction by a significant margin. Senator Voss, who had been awake for the entire crisis managing the politics from his end, later said it was the single most effective piece of political messaging he had ever seen. The broadcast of a Class 3 civilization, calmly explaining to a Velarath fleet commander exactly how badly they intended to hurt him if he continued. Not threatening to win, not claiming they could destroy the fleet. Just explaining, very clearly, what the cost would be, and then leaving the decision to him. "They understood deterrence," he told his aide afterward. "It is what they have always done. They build something that will hurt. They point it at you, and they talk." The fleet withdrew. Kesov was recalled. There would be a tribunal. Sarath stayed on Earth for another 2 weeks after the crisis ended. He wanted to see it. He told Priya that he had read about it for days, and talked about it for days, and now he wanted to actually look at it. They took him to Geneva first, then to a small village in Japan, where one of the oldest living trees in the world grew in a temple garden, then to the coast of Norway, where the sun did not set in summer, and the sky turned colors that Sarath stood in for nearly an hour without speaking. He met a number of humans, scientists and farmers and children, and one very old woman in Mumbai, who had no idea who he was, and just wanted to know if he liked spicy food. He tried her food. It was extremely hot. His eyes watered. He ate all of it. She gave him more. On his last evening before returning to his ship, he sat with Priya on a hillside outside the facility in Nevada. The sky was clear. There were stars, more visible out here than in the cities, Priya had told him. He looked up at them for a long time. "You know," he said finally, "when we first detected your world, the classification was automatic. Class 3, pre-FTL, non-threatening." "I know," said Priya. "We were wrong about all three." He paused. "You are not a Class 3. You are something we do not have a classification for." He paused again. "You are also, very clearly, not non-threatening. We try not to threaten anyone who doesn't threaten us first," said Priya. "Yes," said Sarath. "That is exactly what makes you threatening." He looked at her. "A civilization that fights back is manageable. A civilization that only fights back, that fights carefully, that talks while it fights, that stops fighting the moment the threat stops. That is a civilization that is impossible to predict." "Is that bad?" Sarath was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I think it is the reason you are still here." He looked back at the stars. "I am going to recommend something to the Senate that has not been recommended in 2,000 years. "What?" "A full partnership, not absorption, not membership in the traditional sense. A partnership between two civilizations as equals, with mutual obligations and mutual benefits, negotiated on terms you find acceptable." Priya was quiet. "Why?" she said finally. "The Senate's resources, its technology, its reach. You are so much larger than us. What do you get out of a partnership with a species that hasn't even left its own solar system?" Sarath looked at her for a long moment. "Your fleet commander," he said, "spent 4 hours watching you reorganize your entire orbital network in real time, with nations that hate each other, using technology built over 50 years by a dozen different organizations that was never designed to work together. And you made it work." "We improvised," said Priya. "Yes," he tilted his head slightly. "We have been doing things the same way for 4,000 years, because our way works. When something new appears, we absorb it into the existing system. We adjust the new thing to fit us." He paused. "We never considered that the new thing might teach us something." He looked back at the stars. "You improvise. You adapt. You take things that should not work and make them work anyway, because you have no other choice. That is not a Class 3 trait. That is not a trait we have a category for." "You want to learn from us," said Priya. "I think," said Sarath, "that in 200 years, when you have FTL capability and you expand into the galaxy, you are going to do it very fast, and in ways that nobody is going to predict." He paused. "I would rather be beside you when that happens than in front of you." Priya looked at him for a moment. Then she looked up at the stars. They were the same stars she had looked at her whole life, the same ones she had pointed radio telescopes at and waited to hear something from. They had always seemed impossibly far away, impossibly silent. They did not seem that way anymore. "All right," she said. "Let's talk about what a partnership looks like." Sarath nodded. Above them, in the clear Nevada sky, the stars were very bright. Somewhere among them, a fleet was retreating. A Senate was in session. 1,000 worlds were going about their lives, not yet knowing that something had changed. And on a small blue planet that had never been in anyone's records, a species that had been alone for all of its history was, for the first time, not alone. They were still figuring out what that meant. But they were going to figure it out the way they figured everything out, by refusing to stop until they did.